Now, Joe Biden's efforts to tamp down tensions in the escalating war between Israel and Hamas faced massive setbacks even before he departed for West Asia. Jordan called off the U.S. president's planned summit with Arab leaders after a deadly explosion at the Gaza hospital, killing hundreds. The postponement of the Amman summit comes after Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas withdrew from the scheduled meetings in protest of the attacks. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza blamed an Israeli airstrike. The Israeli military said that it had no involvement and pinned the blame on a misfired Palestinian rocket. Jordan's foreign minister said, and I quote, that this war and the aggression are pushing the region to the brink. He stated that Jordan would only host the summit when all participants agreed on its purpose, which would be to stop the war and respect the humanity of the Palestinians. Now, while in the air, Biden released a statement saying that he was outraged and deeply saddened by the explosion at the hospital and the terrible loss of life that resulted. He said immediately he spoke after hearing the news with King Abdullah II of Jordan and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Biden added that he has directed his national security team to continue gathering information about what exactly happened. The cancellation of the Jordan leg of the trip reflects an increasingly volatile situation that will test the limits of American influence in the region. Now, here's why the Jordan summit was crucial for the U.S. president. The Israel-Palestinian conflict has been ongoing for decades, and to a large extent, it's involved in the same cadre of leaders. Netanyahu is the longest-serving prime minister in Israeli history. Abbas has been Palestinian president for nearly 20 years. Abdullah II has been king since 1999. Biden has called the Jordanian king a loyal ally in a tough neighborhood. Al-Sisi is the newest leader, president of Egypt since 2014. Furious protesters tried to storm the Israeli embassy in Amman, where Biden was due to meet Arab leaders. Lebanon's Iran-backed Hezbollah called for a day of rage over the strike to coincide with Biden's arrival. It fueled fears of the very escalation by Tehran and its allies that the U.S. president's visit is supposed to warn against. Tear gas fired near U.S. embassy in Lebanon at protesters. Hundreds of angry protesters gathered outside the French embassy in Tunisia on Tuesday, also denouncing the United States. In Iraq, scores of protesters gather near Baghdad's Green Zone following the Gaza hospital blast. French President Emmanuel Macron said that nothing can justify targeting civilians and called for humanitarian access without delay. Qatar's foreign ministry called the hospital strike a dangerous escalation in the course of the confrontations. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan condemned the incident as the latest example of Israeli attacks devoid of the most basic human values. The United Nations Human Rights Chief called the hospital strike totally unacceptable, insisting that the perpetrators must be held to account.
We know that our environment is...
Russia and the United Arab Emirates called for an emergency UN Security Council meeting. European Union's Charles Michel said that targeting civilian infrastructure in Gaza breaks international law. The African Union chief accused Israel of a war crime following the deadly strike. Now, for more on this, we are joined by our correspondent, Susan Tehrani from New York. Susan, thank you for joining us. Now, Susan, the Gaza hospital carnage takes place just hours after Biden's announcement of West Asia trip. How do you think this will impact Biden's visit?
Yeah, this was a high-stake visit from the start when President Biden decided to head to the Middle East, and now it's only become more complex and more complicated after this attack on the hospital in Gaza. As you mentioned yourself, both sides are blaming one another on the one hand, and on the other hand, President Biden's meeting with Arab leaders has also been canceled. While we did hear from the very start, immediately after the hospital in Gaza was attacked, that Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas said that he would cancel his meeting with President Biden. And then shortly after, we heard that Jordan wants to cancel that summit, which President Sisi of Egypt was also part of. While he was in the air, President Biden and the White House released a statement saying that it was an agreement between the two sides, between President Biden and Arab leaders, to not go on with this meeting. It was basically for the reason, one of them being that there will be 3 days of mourning due to this attack on the hospital. So they sort of glazed over it. But regardless, it's not a good look for the president of the United States, for Arab leaders to cancel on him at such a critical time. He is going to Israel. Some of his critics are wondering why he's going to Israel at all. So that's a complication as well. Yes, America's support is important, but he would have perhaps been more influential at this point if he would have given that support and granted that support from Camp David. And again, we can talk about the political implications for him here in the United States and what Americans are thinking about this trip as well.
Sure, and amidst all these hostilities, there's also a question of security of the U.S. president in a conflict region. Can you help us understand what preparations have been put in place for that?
Yeah, there's no doubt that not only the Israelis, but the Americans are taking the utmost precaution for the U.S. president to go in a conflict zone like this. But as you mentioned, these are extraordinary conditions right now. It is a time when U.S. embassies are being ambushed and attacked by sympathizers of Hamas, not only in Lebanon, but across the Middle East as well. It's also a time that it's right before a possible ground offensive by Israel into Gaza to destroy Hamas. Now, the question is, will the president's visit to Israel delay that ground offensive and give Hamas more time to plan its next moves, or will the president visit to Israel fan the flames of fury, not only among the Palestinians, the Hamas militants, but also among the Arab world as well? So it's again a very dire situation in terms of security, but also it's interesting that some Israelis were concerned that when the president comes, although the White House has denied this, that if Israel had planned on a ground offensive earlier, then they would have to wait until President Biden leaves.
Sure, and also about speculations of there are speculations of a possibility of a ceasefire or a peace deal in West Asia, especially following Antony Blinken's meeting in the region. What happens to that? Any kind of developments on that front or any possibility?
Well, I think they prefer to call it a negotiated settlement ultimately, because the word ceasefire is something that's very sensitive, not only among Americans here that support their Jewish allies and among the Jewish community here, because a ceasefire would then mean a ceasefire with a designated group by the State Department, which is a terrorist designated group, which is Hamas. So it's not so much about a ceasefire, but more maybe a sort of a negotiated settlement on how hostages can be released, on what conditions, and under what conditions perhaps aid can be granted to Gaza as well. Even if you want to talk about some sort of quote unquote ceasefire, well, when President Biden is not meeting with any of the Arab leaders and the Arab world seems to be unified in condemning Israel, despite the fact that there are various reports on who was really responsible for this hospital bombing, then again, that in that aspect becomes very difficult as well.
Sure, Susan. Thank you so much for giving that perspective and your inputs. Thank you for your time.